All right. Hope you all had a decent weekend. Though weekends are weird now, right? It's sort of weekends aren't different from normal days, or at least in my case, that's how it sort of feels. Still doing the same basic things, but hope you had a good one at any rate. I got the exams all graded, so you all should have gotten those back. Uh, yeah, like I said in the email, the average score was right around the middle B, right around 85%. So that's exactly what sort of aiming for. On the whole, people did fine. I had no major concerns. Yeah, the scores were all even people who are getting stuff wrong were getting stuff wrong usually in a close way as opposed to just completely not getting it. So it's good. I was perfectly content and happy with the grades and the exams. Um, Anyone has any questions about any particular question or why they got the score that they did in a particular question, no problem. Just let me know and ask me. But instead of giving you comments, we just sort of went over it as a class last time. So I'm happy to go over any sort of specific questions anyone has. We're going to pretty much just spend all of today talking about causal arguments. My guess is we won't get through the discussion of causal arguments today, and that'll continue into the next class period. And that'll be fine if that's the case. We're going to try to go over lots of examples, see if we can actually have some actual conversation rather than just me lecturing today. And then maybe we'll do a little bit of group stuff on Wednesday, and then hopefully almost all of Friday we'll be doing some group stuff too. So that's the week plan. Any questions or thoughts or anything, any sort of business before we get started? All right, great. Then let's just begin. I just want to go over the last quiz really fast. So last quiz was looking at some analogical arguments. So first question was to determine if we're looking at a precedent analogy or a causal historical analogy. The argument was the police officer was not justified in pulling my car over for speeding. Plenty of other cars were speeding at exactly the same stretch of highway at exactly the same time I was, and he didn't pull any of those cars over. We're not looking at causality. This is a little bit relevant, right? We're not going to be describing why some event happened. We're not talking about why did the police officer pull my car over. That would be a causal question. We're asking, is it fair, reasonable? Was his reasoning consistent in why he pulled me over and not someone else over? So we're looking at a precedent analogy in this case. Then you were asked to just go through an analogical argument and analyze it. I aced my English exam without even studying. You and I both got the same grades and worked equally hard. So you should ace your organic chemistry exam without even studying too. From the quizzes that I've graded, and I've graded about half of them so far, the hardest part of this question was actually getting precisely what the analogs are correct. People who got the analogs at least close usually did pretty well in the problem. If you didn't quite get the analogs right, people tended to struggle a little bit more. So I saw basically two ways you could sort of put what the analogs are. One way of putting it, you could just say we're comparing English exams to organic chemistry exams. And if you put it that way, that way seems to work. We're sort of talking about these two different kinds of exams. The way I would have put it, and a few people sort of put it in roughly this form, how I perform in school versus how you perform in school. Either of these ways gets it right. Some people said acing the exams are the two things being compared, and that doesn't really work. That's not really the comparison. That's more the conclusion the argument reaches about the comparison. Similarly, other people just sort of listed some of the similarities here. So like some people said the analogs were like me studying hard versus you studying hard. But again, those are the things that the argument are saying are similar between you and me, not so much what's being compared themselves. Those are similarities between the groups that are being compared. So what matters in this case fundamentally is how are English exams like organic chemistry exams. So what are the similarities? It's the things that the argument indicates, and we'll just take the argument. You can just take the argument at its word, I suppose. We get this. You and I get the same grades in general. We work equally hard in general. Got a chat question real fast. Someone's asking, is it too specific to say your organic chemistry exam versus my English exam? No, that would probably be fine too. Yeah, that's actually not too specific at all. I think that would work equally well in this case. What we don't want is we don't want to get to the things that are the similarities or disadvantages. That's what we don't want. So me doing well on my English exam versus you doing well in your chemistry exam. This one is too specific. This would be too much, because this is pointing to what the argument is saying is going to be similar between the two cases, rather than just the two cases themselves. So not that, but if you wanted to specify it to my English exam, your organic chemistry exam, that's fine. That's not too specific. That's still, basically what you want to make sure you're capturing with the analogs is what things are getting compared, what things are we going to say are similar or different. And in this case, I think it's fine. What matters in this case is this analogy. This is a pretty bad argument. And why is it a bad argument? It's a bad argument because English exams and organic chemistry exams are nothing alike. They're almost completely different, right? English exam, I mean, if nothing else, I mean, you know, as though probably at least some of you have actually taken organic chemistry exams, and so you can sort of validate this for the rest of the class. If nothing else, it's way easier to just be blunt bullshit in English exam than it is in organic chemistry exam. Just like in most philosophy classes, actually, logic is sort of the exception. In most philosophy classes, it's way easier to bullshit an answer. In logic, you kind of can't bullshit it, right? There's sort of right and wrong answers. The same thing is kind of true in organic chemistry, right? There's clear right or wrong answers, and not only that, organic chemistry is one of the hardest classes in universities. So even if it's true, let's say if the analogs in this case sort of had been my English exam versus your English exam, and then we would expect, yeah, they probably will do about the same on the English exam if they're about equal students. But even equal students will tend to have to study far harder for an organic chemistry exam to do well in it than for an English exam. And so I would say bad analogy. Some people said it outright commits the fallacy. Some people just said it was a bad analogy. Either of those is fine. I'm not going to worry about that distinction too much. You got a bad analogy. You could not have to study for an English exam, but still need to study for the organic chemistry exam. Not saying you needed more information is in principle fine for that problem, but again, what mattered was the information. Some people said they needed more information, and it seemed to me like they were sort of, the information they wanted, I guess, wasn't sort of getting to the heart of it. Some people had no real background with organic chemistry and just said they would want to know if organic chemistry exams were about as hard as English exams. That indeed is quite pertinent information, and if you didn't know that, then yeah, you might well not have enough information to actually evaluate the analogy in this case. Any questions about that? I have about half of them, those quizzes graded. I'll get the other half graded after class today. All right, then let's turn to causal arguments, and we'll spend probably at least the rest of this week on causal arguments, maybe even a little bit more. So just to begin, let's go over precisely what it is that we're even talking about when we're talking about causal arguments. And also, as a real quick note, the book has a pretty good discussion, actually, about how causation is different from explanation. It's a good discussion. It's interesting. It's worth reading. But it's not something that we're going to really worry about. Causality is fundamentally what's called a metaphysical question in philosophy. It's not really per se a logical question. And so distinguishing causation from explanation, again, that tends to be more of a metaphysical issue rather than a logical one. The metaphysical issues involved with causation are actually super complex, super contentious. If any of you have taken more advanced philosophy classes where questions of causation actually get raised, what you'll find is that this is one of the more highly contentious areas of all of philosophy, figuring out precisely what a cause is. We're not really going to so much worry about those kinds of details, about exactly what we mean by causation. We're going to use the term cause in a pretty broad term, in a pretty normal sense of it. The sort of logical worry, rather than the metaphysical worry, isn't so much going to be how causality differs from explanation. It's really going to be what constitutes a good causal explanation. What's a good causal argument? When is an argument giving you a good reason to believe that one thing is really a cause? That's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on this logical question: what makes a causal argument a good argument? Okay. So what do we mean by causes? Let's just get really broad before we go anywhere else with it. All we really mean by a cause is it's an answer to a why question. Right? Why did something happen, or why did such events in general happen? So what would be an example of a causal answer? Right? Why did I throw up last night? Because I had food poisoning. I didn't, just in case anyone's worried. But class would have been canceled if I had. But just in general, right? Why would I have thrown up last night? Oh, because I had food poisoning. Food poisoning gives you the reason why that event happened than me getting sick. There's different kinds of causal counts. We'll go through a few of them. Again, none of that's really going to be directly relevant to the logic, but it might help you understand the argument a little bit. What matters, what we're going to focus on is the idea of a causal argument. So arguments also answer why questions. They answer a slightly different why question. Arguments answer the question, why should I believe that the conclusion of the argument is actually true? So they're slightly different questions, but you can ask why should I believe something is true questions about causal conclusions. And that's what a causal argument is going to be. So a causal argument, let's just define it. It's any argument that answers the question, why should I believe that X is the cause of Y? Why should I believe that food poisoning is the cause of me throwing up last night? Why wasn't it me going on a bender and drinking too much alcohol? That's also a plausible cause for why I could have thrown up. Why should we believe that food poisoning is a better causal explanation than too much alcohol or alcohol poisoning? In terms of this sort of what we're calling these sort of causal questions, there's two broad categories of causal questions. So there's specific causes and general causes. A specific cause is looking for the cause of some concrete particular event, right? So what the example that I've been using, that would be an example of a specific causal question. Why did I get food poisoning, to be more specific, last night? Right? We're talking about some very specific instance. Why, and then the causal answer is also going to be something really specific, really particular. Why did I get food poisoning last night? Because last night I ate that undercooked chili. And that undercooked chili gave me some food poisoning. Right? Specific cause, specific effect. There's also, though, general causal questions. These are like, why do events sort of in general tend to happen the way that they do, right? So not why did I get food poisoning? Why do people in general get food poisoning? What's the generally speaking cause of food poisoning? You can't say eating undercooked chili, because people get food poisoning for all kinds of reasons. But what do all those reasons tend to have in common? Well, usually people get food poisoning because they eat something that contains a harmful bacteria or virus. That would be the causal explanation of this more general question. Another example of this, does smoking cause lung cancer? Right? That's a general question. We're not saying every single person who smokes is necessarily going to get lung cancer, but but what we're saying is there's some kind of relationship in general between smoking and lung cancer. We'll actually, in a few minutes, we'll say a little bit more precisely what kind of causal question that's in specific is. So these two broad categories, specific and general causes, in general, our approach to looking at causal arguments will be the same for both. We won't need to really modify very much, depending on whether or not we're looking at these differences. What really will just matter is in how you interpret what the argument is asking. General causes usually just have it's not even exactly a lower standard, but they're almost just a little bit vaguer, the causal evidence, whereas the causal evidence in specific cases is going to need to be really specific, right? The difference between a general explanation versus a specific one. So before we go any further, let's just pause for a second. Any questions about any of these initial moves? All right, good. Let's do a little bit more background, and then let's actually, before we even actually start looking at any specific arguments, I just want to talk about how we causally reason in general. So let's do a little bit more background, then we'll get to that. All right. Last little bit of background. Let's tie in something we did a little bit earlier. How do necessary and sufficient conditions relate to causality? Because they actually do, so this will be a little helpful way of connecting with something we talked about earlier. So the basic structure of causality is that you identify a cause, and the cause explains the effect. So usually, actually, the way it works sort of logically is different than how it works in fact. Logically, you usually have some effect and you want to know why it happens. And almost all of the arguments that we're going to look at, they're going to have that sort of structure. In argumentative terms, you sort of know that something happened, that there's some effect, and you look for the cause that explains why that effect happened, right? So I threw up last night, why? The gross domestic product has decreased, why? My pen falls when I drop it, why? Right? I know some specific effect. What I want to know is the cause. But in sort of terms of the actual sort of order, in the world, the cause comes first, right? The cause comes first, then the effect comes afterwards. Okay. There are a couple of different ways that a cause can be related to an effect. There are necessary causes. If the cause isn't there, the effect won't be there for this kind of cause. And a lot of the examples we were looking at are when we were talking about necessary and sufficient conditions earlier in the semester, they were indeed causal examples, right? So oxygen is a necessary cause for fire to break out. If you don't have oxygen, you're not going to get fires. There are also sufficient causes. If the cause is there, the effect will always happen. Again, shooting me in the head is a sufficient cause for my death. Most causes aren't going to fit either of these categories, though. Most causes are what we're going to call contributory causes, or they're also get called causal factors, rather than either being a necessary or a sufficient cause. These are cases where the cause being present makes the effect more likely to happen, but it isn't guaranteed. So let's do a contemporary example, a cutting edge, straight from the headlines example of this. The coronavirus is a contributory cause of people dying. Just because you get the coronavirus, it doesn't ensure that you're going to die, right? Indeed, even the most pessimistic of estimates is that it has maybe like a 2% death rate. So 98% of the people who get the coronavirus won't die from it. So merely getting the virus, that's not sufficient to kill you. But it makes it far more likely than it otherwise would, right? Even if it's only a 2% chance, Very few things in life give you a 2% chance of dying. At least very few things that we tend to actually encounter normally would give you a 2% chance of dying. So it is certainly the case that the coronavirus is a cause, but it's not a sufficient cause of death. It's a contributory cause of it. It makes it more likely to happen. Similarly, let's go a lower stakes example of this, right? Studying for an exam. Is also a contributory cause of doing well. It doesn't guarantee it. It doesn't ensure that you'll do well in the exam just because you studied. I wish it did. I wish studying and hard work was a sufficient cause of getting good grades. It sadly is not, right? But it does contribute to it. You're way more likely to do better on an exam if you study hard for it than if you don't study hard for it. So again, none of this is really going to factor into sort of our logical analysis of causal arguments. What it might be helpful with is just, again, keeping some of these distinctions in mind so that we can remember, almost just know for precisely what level of evidence that we need to be looking for to draw causal connections. If I'm saying that something is a sufficient cause, I need a lot of evidence. Similarly, if I'm saying something is a necessary cause, I need a lot of evidence. I have to eliminate every other possible thing that could be going on. Contributory causes, the standard is just a little bit lower, right? Lots of people smoke but don't die. That doesn't mean that smoking doesn't cause death. It just causes it in a contributory way rather than in a sufficient or necessary way. So just things that help keep in mind for when we're actually sort of looking at causal arguments. All right. So how are we doing with any of that stuff, all that sort of background stuff? So any questions about any of this sort of background material? Nathan, go ahead. You should be unmuted.
So for something like a contributory cause, you could make an argument that everyone who drinks water dies. At what point do we stop with the contributory causes where it really has no effect on your death? It's just a happenstance.
That's a great question, and I'm not going to be able to answer it yet, but I should be able to answer it at the very least by Wednesday. So what we're going to call that, what you just pointed toward, is a correlation. Drinking water and dying are indeed correlated, but they're not going to be causally connected. And one of the things that you're going to need to be checking for when you go through causal arguments is to make sure that you don't just have a correlation between events, but really causality. So basically, this answer is basically hold the question. It's a really good one. We'll go into it more later, but indeed it is a very important point. But contributory causes, they are more than just a correlation between events. There still does need to be some actual causal relationship between them, and so there still is indeed a real standard that will need to be met. So I hope that's at least helpful in a preliminary sense. Your question is at the very least on exactly the right track. All right, good. Any other sort of initial questions just on the background? All right. Let's actually just talk for a little bit before we actually start doing all the logic stuff, because I want to actually talk about how we actually reason. So this is a case that actually happened to me a little bit ago. So I was in this basement, right? And I was working out. As you can see, I have some gym equipment over there in the distance. And all of a sudden, while I was working out, all of the lights went out in the basement, right? It was a little spooky, right? It was actually right around Halloween last year, so it was actually indeed was a little bit spooky. Okay, so I presumably will want to know what happened, right? And indeed I did. Why did all these lights go out, right? Okay, so let's walk it through. This happens. This sort of thing happens all the time. What would you do to figure out why all the lights went out in the basement? What steps would you take? Well, at the very least, I can start with this. I can tell you what I did. First thing I did, I went upstairs and I checked to see if the other lights in my house were out or if they were just in the basement. Right? I have someone in the chat suggest maybe you could check the breaker box. Yep, that seems like a good candidate. Here's a question. Should I call an exorcist? Is it a ghost? Could a ghost be why all the lights came out? Someone responded, not unless I'm loony. Which is indeed, yeah, fair enough. But why? Let's actually say a little bit. Why not? Why does ghost? Why does that not seem like a good explanation? I mean, we've probably all seen movies where ghosts cause lights to flicker. But why isn't that really an acceptable causal explanation? Why would I go to things like the breaker box? Why would I go to things like the light bulbs having burned out? Why wouldn't I go to ghosts? One way you could articulate it, one way you could think about it, we've all got starting a kind of a rough idea of why certain events actually happen. So why does the electricity work? Even if we can't clearly articulate why, we all have a rough sense of why electricity works, right? What is it? It works because there are these wires. It works because there are power plants out there. It works because of electricity, right? And if I asked you, if I really pushed you to explain to me, how do you know any of that? You probably, unless you were, maybe like an electrical engineer or something, you probably couldn't really give me a great explanation of why you believe that those are that's sort of the reasonable kind of cause, and ghosts aren't the reasonable kind of cause. Right? I mean, again, you say, the chat comment was sort of well taken, like unless you're kind of loony, then maybe you think it's a ghost. But sort of like, why? How do we sort of know that the ghost explanation isn't a good one? If we were living in the 1500s, I mean, so there wouldn't have been light bulbs in the 1500s, right? But things like ghosts people would have been far more likely to have gone to that kind of explanation. And they wouldn't have thought it was loony. And indeed, even people who thought it was like not true, they wouldn't have thought it was a crazy explanation. We sort of rely, when we're giving causal accounts of the world, upon kind of background causal frameworks. So we know that electricity, that tends to come from power plants rather than hamsters running on wheels. We know that food poisoning tends to come from diseases. It doesn't tend to come from evil gnomes burrowing into my stomach and sort of pressing on it really hard. We know that, this pen tends to fall because of things like gravity. It's not falling because some, angel is pushing it down to the ground. Right? We all have this as sort of this background causal framework. When we're looking at causality and looking at causal arguments, by and large, what we're going to be doing is actually just presupposing this background causal framework that all of us have. We're not really going to be challenging the causal framework itself. That's hilarious. I'm just at the end of what apparently that text box would have accepted. 5 characters short. We're not, let's actually, let's sort of like think this through for a second, right? Like, what would it actually take to persuade you that a ghost actually did cause the power to go out in my basement? Because that's not impossible, right? It could be true. I mean, again, we don't think it's true. It would be a shocking turn of events if it turned out that that's actually why light bulbs burn out, is because of ghosts. But what would it actually take to persuade you of that, right? What would that actually require to sort of see, or what evidence would you need? At the very least, it would be extraordinary, right? Someone suggested evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think that's fair enough, but I almost think that's underselling it, right? Like, I mean, we arrest people or convict people in court based on evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And I feel like the evidence I would need to convict someone of murder is way less than the evidence I would need to convict someone. I would need to conclude that like a ghost had possessed the person that made them into a murderer. I mean, the way this usually gets put, if you make an extraordinary claim, a claim that sort of violates the normally established causal framework, you need extraordinary evidence, right? And way someone's putting it in the chat, and I think they're right to put it this way. You would need overwhelming evidence that there's things that you just can't explain unless ghosts are real, right? Ghosts would only ever be a possible explanation is if there was something that the normal framework couldn't explain that we needed ghosts to actually explain. And even then, even when you find this overwhelming evidence, your first thought shouldn't be ghosts, so to speak. Your first thought shouldn't be, oh, the causal framework is wrong. Your first thought should be, oh, I'll try to discover some way of fitting this crazy new information into my already established causal framework. It has indeed, throughout the course of human history, happened that established causal frameworks need to be overturned. Here's one example of when. We used to believe that the Earth was the center of the universe and that everything else revolved around the Earth. All the planets, all the stars, and the sun itself revolved around the Earth. Okay? People didn't believe this for no good reason. People had very good reasons to believe this. It fit certain visual experiential data that they had. And so people developed a causal framework. It was called the Ptolemaic model of the universe, to explain why, for example, it looks like the sun is moving across the sky, why the moon looks like it's moving across the sky, why the stars look like they're moving across the sky, right? Why all of those things happening? Because indeed they really are moving and Earth is staying still. This Ptolemaic model was a perfectly good model. It fit the data reasonably well, and it had good math behind it. There were some problems. There were things it couldn't explain. But by and large, you would not have been rational to have rejected the Ptolemaic model, even though it's wrong. That's the weird thing. Even though that model is going to turn out to be wrong, at the time, you wouldn't have been rational to have rejected it out of hand. It fit the data reasonably well, and it was a well-established causal theory. What changed? So we started making basically better telescopes, right, that were letting us make slightly more precise explanations. And the Ptolemaic model didn't fit these more precise explanations very well. It fit it fine still, but there were started to be more and more gaps, more and more things more and more data that the causal framework wasn't fitting. And so this led people to posit a new causal framework, right? What was called the Copernican model, the model where the Earth was what was in the center and the Earth revolved around the sun. Okay? So eventually, right, it became irrational as the Copernican model got more and more support. It became irrational for people to believe in the Ptolemaic system, but that was because new evidence was acquired. The very odd thing that we're going to discover, this is going to be really important when we actually sort of start looking at some of these arguments. When we're looking and talking about causality, what we should always be looking for is the best available explanation. Got a chat question. Hold on for 1 second. So where would the flat earthers fall into this scenario? We're actually going to talk about them more direct. The flat earth theory is this group of people now that argue that the earth is really flat. Which is, it's a little bit, it's even sort of extra goofy because actually the ancients didn't even really believe that the earth was flat. From what I can tell, no one really has ever believed that the earth was flat. From what I can actually tell historically, this was never really a view that anyone really believed, or at least any of the sort of scientists of the time really believed. But so the flat earthers, so at the very least, if we're being as charitable to them as possible, we would say they would need to present us with overwhelming evidence to believe that the earth is flat because of how wildly outside they are of the established causal framework. Right. And just saying, I'm not sure I fully understand how GPS systems work, that's not enough. So therefore the earth is flat. Nope, that doesn't follow. Right. We're at the end of the semester, if we're going to have time, and I think we will because we're making pretty good progress, we're actually going to look at what are called extraordinary claims and conspiracy theories. So near the end of the class, and talk about how to actually sort of logically evaluate such things. So flat earthers, they would be advocates of sort of extraordinary claims. The example of a conspiracy theory would be that the coronavirus was really made in a Chinese laboratory. That would be a conspiracy theory. They're similar. Conspiracy theories tend to also be extraordinary claims. Both of them, what makes them difficult to evaluate is that both kinds of things are going to be outside of established causal frameworks. And so that as a result, at the very least, we can say right now, if you're for either kind of claim, you should expect overwhelming evidence in support of the claim. Because indeed, those kinds of claims are going to be outside of the established causal framework. So I hope that answers the chat question. If not, send me a follow-up. It turns out I can see the chat on this. I just can't see the thumbs up or anything. So send me a follow-up if you have a follow-up on that question. So what do I mean by the best available explanation? I mean the explanation that fits all of the available data better than any other. That's what we're looking for. That's what we should want. Why is it going to be right to say, or reasonable to conclude, hey, why did I throw up last night? Oh, because I ate some undercooked chili and got food poisoning. Okay. That explanation will only be reasonable if it's the best available explanation, if it fits all the information available to me better than any other possible explanation. Right? I have no evidence or no reason to believe that I was poisoned. I have no evidence or reason to believe that I have stomach cancer, but I do have reason to believe that I ate undercooked chili and that eating undercooked chili could perhaps make one sick. So based on the data available to me, that explanation fits better than all the other candidates. The best available explanation can change if you acquire new evidence. Right? Let's say a week later, I discover evidence that actually someone was trying to poison me. That someone had broken into my house maybe the night before I threw up. Well, okay, that new evidence, that changes what's the best available explanation, right? Now, what the bad chili explanation doesn't fit as much of the information as someone's trying to poison the explanation, right? But it's only because new evidence was acquired. The key thing here is that regardless of the fact that the best available explanation can change, you are nevertheless obligated rationally to believe the best available explanation that you have at a particular moment in time. People always sort of complain about like nutrition advice, for example. Like people always complain like, oh, 1 minute the scientists are saying that eggs are unhealthy. The next they say eggs are healthy. Then they say sometimes eggs are healthy, sometimes eggs are not healthy. This is frustrating. This is infuriating. I understand the sense of that there's something frustrating about that, right? It'd be great because you have to actually act on the basis of those guidelines, right? And it's frustrating if the guidelines are always changing. But we sort of want those guidelines to change if new evidence is discovered. That would be sort of the rational thing to do. If you acquire new evidence that makes a new thing the best available explanation of something, your reasoning should change. But that doesn't authorize you to not believe what the best available explanation is at a given moment. And the reason sort of why is because, well, okay, if you're not going to believe the best explanation available to you at a given moment in time, what explanation are you going to believe? Right? Any other explanation you pick is going to have less evidence for it than the best available explanation, definitionally, right? That's just sort of the definition. The best explanation available to you, that's the best explanation available to you. And believing in a different one, just there's no good reason to believe anything other than the best available explanation. So controversial, let's get controversial for a second. We're going to talk a little bit more about global warming in the next unit when we talk about arguments from authority. But let's just say for the sake of argument, just assume. Assume for the sake of argument that the best available evidence all suggests that global warming is happening and is caused by human factors. Right? So let's just make that be an assumption. Right. Well, again, we'll talk about, is that a reasonable assumption? Why should you believe that a little bit later when we talk about appeals to authority. But let's just, as for the sake of argument, let's just assume this. Assume that this is true. All right. Now, could it turn out that new evidence will be acquired in the future? Could that happen? Sure. Sure, it could. We could always acquire new evidence in the future, right? Again, that's the whole point of inductive arguments in general, and probative inductive arguments in specific, is that new evidence could indeed always lead us to reevaluate things. It's also possible no new evidence will be acquired. Both of those are possible, right? And you can't know which will turn out to be true. Okay, well, what's the rational thing to believe now? Well, the rational thing to believe now is that global warming is indeed caused by human factors. That's the most rational thing for you to believe now. Now, you shouldn't become, oh, where we go? Sorry, clicked on the wrong thing. Lost the whiteboard for a second. There we go. Yeah. You shouldn't believe this dogmatically. You shouldn't reach this conclusion in the face of all new evidence. If new evidence is acquired, great, change your belief. Your belief should change on the basis of the acquiring of new evidence, right? If no new evidence is acquired, you can continue maintaining your belief. Again, great, that's fine, right? The point here is not that we're being dogmatic about this. It's just that, again, if we're assuming this for the sake of argument, that this is the best available explanation, this is the rational thing to believe. You have no evidence. The evidence doesn't support any other conclusion other than this one. Even if 5 years from now we acquire new evidence that causes us to change our minds, it would still be rational today to believe this conclusion, assuming this really is the best available explanation. Right? If we make that assumption, this really would be the rational thing to believe. The fact that things could change in the future doesn't change what's sort of rational for me right now. I always have to act right now on the basis of the evidence available to me. So how are we doing with this idea of the best available explanation? Is this idea making sense to people? Because we're getting near the end of class today, and that's fine. My guess was we're going to need 2 days to go through all this stuff. When we start looking at causal arguments specifically next class period, what we're really going to be focusing on is this idea of the best available explanation. A good causal argument is one that indeed suggests that the actual cause is the one that's actually the best available explanation given all the evidence available to it. And what I'm going to give you 5 criteria. We'll have sort of steps that we'll use to determine what the best available explanation is. How can we tell correlation from just causation? How can we tell various other sorts of things of that sort, right? But what's going to matter is, have we identified the best available explanation? That doesn't mean that this explanation is certain. That's why causal arguments are still going to be inductive arguments. New information could cause us to change our mind, but a good causal evidence is one that takes all the evidence available to it and reaches the most reasonable explanation that discovers the best causal explanation available to it, given the evidence available to it at the moment. I have a chat question. How would professional sports fall into this category? I'm not exactly sure that I follow what you're asking, so maybe do it via, we should do it via just discussion, or you can maybe follow it up on the chat to make it make your question a little bit clearer. I can tell you, at least maybe while you're doing that, sports is certainly one area where people are looking for the best available explanation. And there's a movement in sports now called the analytic movement, where we have all these people trying to use data to try to sort of challenge how we think and understand certain events in sports. So in baseball, for example, there's a bunch of number crunching that was done that sort of suggested that actually certain kinds of plays in baseball are less efficient than other kinds. All of that is based indeed on the data, and it is indeed trying to reach a kind of causal conclusion. But the way that and indeed, if you're being good at your sort of analytics, you should be open to new data challenging your assumptions. That's sort of the whole principle of it, I guess, is that new data will sort of challenge our assumptions about things. So at least, I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were asking, but if that's at least the rough spirit of it, at least, professional sports would certainly be a context in which appeals to the best available explanation get made all the time. Right? The sort of goal, I guess, of all of this causal stuff is not to be dogmatic about it, but to indeed just accept whatever the evidence tells you at a given moment in time. All right. I think it's probably not going to be worth actually starting analyzing the arguments, because we've only got like 3 minutes left. So it probably would be a waste of time to get started with anything additional. So probably what we'll do is on Wednesday, we'll probably go through the 5 criteria that we're going to use to sort of analyze these causal arguments. And my guess is we'll spend most of the day just doing that. We might have time to do maybe a little bit of group work at the end. But most of the day, at least, will be spent going through these 5 causal criteria. And then Friday in particular, we'll just do some straight up group work. That's probably the plan for the week. So thank you all very much. My office hours are right after this, so I'll just leave this chat room open in case anyone wants to come to office hours. So you can just come right here, or stay right here. Otherwise, I'll unmute everyone so we can chat a little bit after class if anyone would like, and I'll see you all on Wednesday. Have a good one.